Our story begins not in the bustling cities of a newborn nation, but on a distant, sun-drenched shore far removed from the world of politics and power. The island of St. Croix, in the Caribbean Sea, was a jewel of sugar and trade, a place where fortunes were made and lost amidst the brutal economy of slavery. Here, in the town of Christiansted, a boy named Alexander Hamilton entered a world defined by impermanence and struggle. Born out of wedlock and later orphaned by the death of his mother and the abandonment of his father, young Alexander was, from his earliest days, acquainted with the harsh winds of circumstance. The tropical paradise of his youth was, for him, a landscape of profound insecurity, where the future was a distant, uncertain horizon across a vast ocean. He was a youth of fierce intelligence and restless energy, traits that could not be contained by the limited prospects his station offered. Employed as a clerk for the trading firm of Beekman and Kruger, he was thrust into the complex mechanics of global commerce. His world was one of ledger books and shipping manifests of rum, cotton, and human souls traded as cargo. From a high stool in a dusty office overlooking the harbor, he absorbed the intricate language of finance, credit, and debt. He saw how capital moved the world, how it built empires and ruined men, and these were lessons he would carry across the sea. Then, in the late summer of 1772, a catastrophe of nature would alter the course of his life forever. A monstrous hurricane swept across the island, a tempest of biblical fury that shattered the landscape. Buildings were flattened, ships were thrown onto the shore like broken toys, and the lush greenery was stripped bare. For many, it was a scene of utter devastation. For the 17-year-old Hamilton, it was a crucible. Witnessing the destruction stirred something deep within him, a need to make sense of the chaos, to give voice to the storm both outside and within. He sat down and poured his soul into a letter to his father, a letter so eloquent, so vividly descriptive and philosophically profound that it transcended mere correspondence. This letter, published in the local Royal Danish American Gazette under the title The Hurricane, became his passport. The local clergymen and merchants who read it were astounded. Here was a mind of remarkable clarity and power, trapped in a clerk's position. Moved by his potential, they pooled their resources to send this promising but penniless young man to the North American mainland for a proper education. His past was a series of fragments, a broken family, a lost home. But as the ship sailed north in 1773, cutting through the Atlantic swells, Hamilton stood at the rail, looking not back at the receding palm trees, but forward. He carried with him no fortune, no family name, only a fierce ambition and the hard-won knowledge from a distant shore, ready to be offered to a continent on the brink of revolution. The New York that Alexander Hamilton entered in 1773 was a city of sharp contrasts, a colonial port simmering with revolutionary fervor. Enrolling at King's College, now Columbia University, he intended to study medicine. But the air itself was electric with debate, and the quiet life of a scholar proved impossible. The pamphlets of the patriots circulated through the streets, and the fiery speeches at taverns and meeting halls were a far more compelling curriculum. Hamilton, the diligent student, soon found his classroom expanding beyond the college walls to encompass the entire, restless city. His keen mind, trained on the ledgers of commerce, now turned to the principles of law, governance, and liberty. He was an outsider, a young man from the islands with a curious accent, but his intellect commanded attention. He began to engage, to debate, and most importantly, to write. While other students might have been content with parsing Latin texts, Hamilton sought out the radical thinkers of the day, engaging in lengthy discussions that stretched into the night. He devoured the works of Hobbes, Locke, and Montesquieu, cross-referencing their theories with the practical grievances he heard in the streets. The lamp in his room at the college burned late, not for anatomy texts, but for political philosophy and the drafting of his own arguments. His first major foray into the public sphere came in 1774, following the Boston Tea Party and the punishing coercive acts. A fiery loyalist clergyman named Samuel Seabury published a series of pamphlets urging caution and loyalty to the crown. Hamilton, then just 19, felt compelled to answer. Under the pseudonym, A Friend to America, he wrote a brilliant, point-by-point rebuttal. His A Full Vindication of the Measures of the Congresses and its sequel were not the rantings of an angry youth, but closely reasoned legal and economic arguments. They displayed a mastery of constitutional principle that belied his age and experience, arguing persuasively for the colony's right to self-governance. This literary battle established him as a voice to be reckoned with. He was no longer just a student. He was a pamphleteer, a patriot in ink. When the call to arms finally came with the first shots at Lexington and Concord in 1775, Hamilton's path was set. The theoretical debates under the students' lamp had reached their logical, violent conclusion. He joined a volunteer militia company, drilling on the green fields near the college. His education was now of a different, more urgent kind. He studied artillery manuals, learned the drill of command, and honed not just his mind, but his resolve. The young man who had arrived seeking knowledge was now prepared to stake his life on the principles he had so meticulously defended on paper, ready to step from the shadow of the academic cloister into the harsh light of history. The winter of 1779 to 1780 was one of the cruelest of the Long War, a season of desperate want that tested the soul of the Continental Army. General George Washington chose the sheltered high ground of Morristown, New Jersey, for his winter encampment, and it was here that Colonel Alexander Hamilton, now his trusted aide-de-camp, would endure a trial by ice and hunger. The romantic notions of war were stripped away by the biting wind that howled through the log huts. The camp was a world of muted grays and frigid whites, where men wrapped in tattered blankets huddled around meager fires, their breath hanging in the crystalline air. Food was scarce, pay was non-existent, and mutiny was a whispered threat in the long, dark nights. In this stark environment, Hamilton's role was that of a vital nerve center. His small desk, piled high with correspondence, was a point of warmth and ceaseless activity. From here, he drafted Washington's urgent appeals to a nearly bankrupt Congress, letters that blended strategic necessity with a profound, paternal pleading for his suffering troops. He translated the general's broad vision into precise, actionable orders. He negotiated with surly local farmers for provisions, mediated disputes between officers, and managed the intricate web of intelligence coming from spies and scouts. The administrative burden was colossal, a war fought with quills and ledger books as much as with muskets. Yet, amidst this grim duty, a personal light flickered into being. It was in Morristown that Hamilton was formally introduced to Elizabeth Schuyler, the daughter of the powerful General Philip Schuyler. Eliza had come to visit her aunt, who lived near the camp. She was a young woman of grace, warmth, and steady character, a stark contrast to the deprivation that surrounded them. Their courtship unfolded in stolen moments, walks along the frozen paths, conversations in parlors warmed by hearth fires. Hamilton, the orphaned immigrant, found in Eliza not just love, but an anchor, a connection to a stable, respected American family. Her steadfastness offered a vision of a future beyond the war, a life of peace and purpose. The camp at Morristown was, therefore, a profound crossroads. It forged Hamilton's understanding of the government's catastrophic financial weaknesses, an object lesson in how a lack of money and supplies could cripple the noblest of causes. It deepened his bond with Washington, a relationship of immense trust tempered by the shared experience of hardship. And it gave him a personal stake in the nation he was helping to build. As the snows finally began to melt, revealing the muddy ground and the resilient promise of spring, Hamilton carried forward from that winter not just the memory of suffering, but the hardened resolve to ensure such suffering would not be in vain, and the quiet hope of a home and a heart to return to. With the war won and a new constitution ratified, the United States in 1789 was a nation in name, but not yet in substance. Its treasury was empty, its credit abroad was a laughingstock, and its economy was a patchwork of state debts and worthless paper money. Into this vacuum of financial chaos stepped the newly appointed Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. His office was a modest room at 57 Maiden Lane in New York City, the temporary capital. Here, at a simple wooden desk, Hamilton would undertake a creative act as daring as any battlefield maneuver. He would attempt to conjure a modern financial system from the ether of debt and distrust. The scale of the challenge was breathtaking. He requested reports on state debts, on revenue, on every facet of the nation's economic life. Piles of documents surrounded him, a paper landscape he had to survey and conquer. His mind, which had once organized military supplies and correspondence, now turned to far more abstract forces: public credit, interest rates, and monetary theory. He worked with a furious, focused energy, often by the light of a single candle long into the night, his quill scratching steadily across page after page. The reports he produced were not mere administrative documents. They were foundational blueprints, persuasive essays meant to guide Congress and convince a skeptical public. The first and most controversial of these was the Report on Public Credit. In it, Hamilton made a radical, seemingly perverse argument: the massive national debt, if properly assumed and managed by the new federal government, could become its greatest source of strength. He proposed that the government fund the debt at face value, combining the war debts of the states into one national obligation. To his critics, like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, this was a scheme to enrich speculators who had bought soldiers' IOUs for pennies. But Hamilton saw a deeper calculus. By making the government's word its bond, he would tie the fortunes of the nation's wealthiest citizens, the creditors, to the success of the federal union. They would have a vested interest in its stability. To manage this debt and create a stable currency, he proposed the creation of a national bank, the Bank of the United States, detailed in his next seminal report. This, too, sparked furious debate over the limits of federal power, a debate Hamilton won by arguing for the Constitution's implied powers. Finally, his report on manufactures laid out a vision for diversifying the agrarian economy through government encouragement of industry. Each document that left the desk at 57 Maiden Lane was a battle in a new kind of war, a war for economic sovereignty. The ink was his ammunition, his logic his strategy. In that quiet room, through the sheer force of intellect and will, Alexander Hamilton built the fiscal foundations upon which the United States would grow, transforming a confederation of states into a cohesive financial nation, one reasoned paragraph at a time. By the mid-1790s, Alexander Hamilton had resigned from Washington's cabinet, but he remained a central, polarizing figure in the nation's political life. Seeking respite from the relentless partisan battles and the yellow fever epidemics that plagued lower Manhattan, he built a country home he named the Grange, after his family's ancestral estate in Scotland. Perched on a rolling, wooded rise in Harlem Heights, it was a sanctuary of pastoral calm, a physical manifestation of his hard-won status. Here, surrounded by 13 acres of land, he could play the role of gentleman farmer, planting orchards and walking with his growing family, his beloved Eliza and their children. The house itself, a graceful federal-style design, was his retreat and his pride. He planned its layout with meticulous care, choosing the placement of windows to catch the morning light. In his study, with views of the Hudson River, he continued his work, writing passionate defenses of Washington's neutrality policy and blistering critiques of his political opponents, most notably Vice President Thomas Jefferson and Secretary of State James Madison. The political storms he helped create in Philadelphia and New York would rage, but from a distance, buffered by the rustle of oak leaves and the laughter of his children in the garden. Here, he was not the bastard brat of a Scottish peddler of political cartoons, but a father, a husband, a host to friends. Yet, the world would not leave him in peace. The intense political rivalries of the era, between the Federalists he led and the Democratic Republicans, grew increasingly personal and bitter. His own personal misstep, a devastating extramarital affair and subsequent blackmail scandal, was exposed, publicly humiliating him and wounding the steadfast Eliza. This vulnerability was exploited by his enemies. But the most profound shadow over the Grange was cast by his long-standing rivalry with Aaron Burr, a man of shifting principles whom Hamilton saw as a dangerous opportunist. When Burr, frustrated by his political failures, sought the governorship of New York, Hamilton worked tirelessly to oppose him, making private comments that would later be cast as accusations of dishonor. The tranquility of Harlem Heights became inextricably linked with the gathering storm. The home represented everything Hamilton was fighting to preserve and protect: stability, family, legacy, and a particular vision of a governed, orderly republic. His walks through his property were now likely tinged with melancholy and a sense of impending conflict. The house stood as a testament to what he had built from nothing, a haven that made the rancor of politics feel all the more corrosive. It was from this peaceful hearth, this symbol of his domestic dreams, that he would depart on a July morning in 1804, riding south to a fateful rendezvous at the dueling grounds of Weehawken, carrying with him the weight of all he had achieved and all he stood to lose. The morning of July 11, 1804, broke clear and hot over the Hudson River. On the New Jersey Palisades at Weehawken, a secluded ledge chosen for its history in settling affairs of honor, the shadows were long and sharp in the early light. Alexander Hamilton arrived first with his second, Nathaniel Pendleton, and a doctor. He had spent the previous evening writing, putting his affairs in order, and attending a party with his family, perhaps stealing a last look at the peaceful domesticity he cherished. His principles were clear. He opposed dueling on both moral and religious grounds, and he had even lost his eldest son, Philip, to a duel on this very ground 3 years prior. The pain of that loss was a fresh wound in his heart. Yet, the complex code of gentlemanly honor in that age presented him with an impossible choice. Aaron Burr, stung by his loss in the New York gubernatorial race and convinced that Hamilton's private criticisms had destroyed his character and career, had demanded a prompt and unqualified acknowledgement or denial of reported insults. Hamilton, believing he could not recant his core political opinions of Burr without sacrificing his own public integrity, felt cornered. He resolved to throw away his fire, to discharge his shot harmlessly into the air. This, he believed, would satisfy the demands of the duel's ritual without taking a life, allowing him to preserve his honor while adhering to his conscience. When Burr arrived, the formalities were observed with cold precision. The pistols were loaded. The distance was measured. The two men, who had once been colleagues at the bar and in the Revolution, now stood as mirror opposites, their backs to each other before turning to face their fate. At the command, Hamilton, true to his plan, raised his pistol and fired high into the air above Burr's head, a blast that startled birds from the trees. The report echoed off the cliff face. But Burr, either not noticing or not accepting this gesture, took deliberate aim and fired. The ball struck Hamilton in the right side, tore through his liver and diaphragm, and lodged in his spine. He fell immediately, uttering, "I am a dead man." The following 31 hours were an agony of fading hope. Rowed back across the river to Manhattan, he was taken to the home of a friend, where Eliza and the children were summoned. Conscious and in excruciating pain, he offered forgiveness and sought to comfort his devastated wife. The city fell into a state of profound shock and mourning. The man who had helped forge the nation was now dying from a wound inflicted by its vice president. In his final moments, he was attended by his family and his clergyman. His last words, as recorded, were of faith and family. The shadows at Weehawken did not just end a life, they cast a long, dark stain over the Republic, a tragic testament to how the passions of politics and pride could eclipse reason and destroy its most brilliant servants, leaving behind a legacy forever marked by a single fatal shot.